Hello, I'm Selma. Welcome back to another literature review. In the past century, insects have been used for everything from genetics and pesticide research to being bred and raised exclusively to feed exotic pets. Throughout this time, insects have been excluded from the argument of the ethics of using animals for research or using animals as food, either for humans or for other animals, as up until recently there was little evidence that insects might feel pain or experience sentience. New research is showing that that might not necessarily be the case. Certain insects may meet the criteria for animals that experience pain. As a pet owner, you might use insects to feed your pet or for enrichment. If you have a reptile or amphibian, you may even have cut a mealworm in half while it was still alive, as some sources recommend for a pet that won't eat. If you have a more traditional pet like a dog or a cat, you may have pointed your pet at a cockroach in the house and let the pet get it instead of dealing with it yourself. All that may have been fine in the past, but is it ethical with the knowledge that insects might feel pain? First, it's important to define a few key concepts for those not familiar with biology of insects and the ethics of using animals in a laboratory or otherwise. Information in this video is based off of nociceptive pathway in the cockroach Paraplanta americana, a paper by Stephen Manuel and Frederick Libersat, and Can Insects Feel Pain? A review of the neural and behavioral evidence, a paper by Matilda Gibbons, Andrew Crump, Megan Barrett, Sadej Sarlak, Jonathan Birch, and Lars Chiquita. Both can be found linked in the description below. Nociception is the ability of an animal to respond to a stimulus that will cause harm. It differs from pain because it goes through a nociceptive pathway. Think of touching a hot burner. Generally, your hand will pull away before you even feel the pain or heat. This is because with nociception, the signal from your hand touching the burner goes to your spinal cord that signals to your hand to pull away before the pain signal reaches your brain. So in summary, pain signals go to the brain, nociceptive signals go to the spinal cord. Nociception is what this video will focus on, but it is one of only 8 different criteria for if an animal can feel pain, as determined by researchers. Let's go through a few of the criteria that cockroaches experience. Cockroaches have been used as the model organism to evaluate if insects feel pain because they are one of the insects with the most knowledge and research available on how their body functions. They have been found to experience nociception. Not many other insects are generally included in these conversations because of lack of research in their anatomy, physiology, and response to stimuli. Second criterion for if an animal feels pain is called sensory integration. Sensory integration defines when an animal can process information from different sources of sensations in regions of the brain. Cockroaches have been proven to be able to process different sensations in parts of their brain known as mushroom body calyxes, which the arrow shows below. The third criterion is integrated nociception, which is a connection between nociception and sensory integration. Integrated nociception requires that an animal's nervous system connects nociceptors to parts of the brain that can interpret those signals. Cockroaches have been found to experience integrated nociception. The other criteria include analgesia, motivational trade-off, flexible self-protection, associative learning, and analgesia preference. The researchers behind Can Insects Feel Pain go into great detail on what each criterion involves and whether or not cockroach experiences each one, and I highly recommend reading it if you are interested in learning the specific criteria. So far, research has shown that cockroaches experience 6 of these 8 criteria. Does this mean that insects definitively feel pain, or does the lack of evidence in 2 criteria mean that they continue to not feel pain despite meeting most of the criteria? These are 2 questions researchers are still asking, and research is continuing to delve into the other 2 criteria and whether or not insects really do feel pain. One such research experiment is the main focus of this video, a study about the nociceptive pathway of the cockroach. The experiment proves that cockroaches experience nociception by showing that stimuli cause responses in sensory nervous axons. Before getting into the study, let's take a look at the nervous system of a cockroach. This image is from the experiment and shows both the cockroach nervous system and part of the experiment setup, but we'll get to the second part later. A cockroach's nervous system has 2 head ganglia, the brain bubble and the bubble labeled SEG, 3 thoracic ganglia, the bubbles labeled T1, T2, and T3, and 6 abdominal ganglia, labeled A1 through A6. Ganglia are clusters of nerve cells that are part of the peripheral nervous system and relay information back to the central nervous system, the brain in case of cockroaches. The experiment used adult male cockroaches raised in crowded conditions. Researchers made a custom-built device to apply tactile and noxious stimuli to the cockroaches with a cauterizer attached to its step motor and a cold probe also attached to a step motor. This device allowed researchers to inflict tactile stimuli, noxious stimuli, brief stimuli, and continuous stimuli and measure the effects of them. Noxious stimuli involves heat, and tactile stimuli involves touch. To measure behavior, cockroaches were placed in a slippery glass platform covered in mineral oil. A photoresistor was placed behind their hind legs to measure leg movement in response to brief and continuous tactile and noxious stimuli to the abdomen. To test the involvement of head ganglia in nociception, cockroaches' heads were surgically removed under anesthesia in this assay. To measure electrophysiology, cockroaches were anesthetized and placed dorsal side up, their legs and wings cut to stumps, and part of their cuticle removed to expose part of their nervous system, from T3 to A6. 3 electrodes were attached to the cockroach, shown in electrodes A, B, C, and D. Nerve 2 was severed to record the response of sensory neurons, and brief and continuous stimuli were inflicted upon the abdomen. Let's get into the results. For the behavioral assay, brief, noxious, and tactile stimuli invoked a fast escape response for all cockroaches. Afterwards, a continuous noxious stimuli was induced, which resulted in a much longer escape duration than continuous tactile stimuli. When measuring with electrodes, researchers found that sensory axons respond much stronger to noxious stimuli than to tactile stimuli. Brief noxious stimuli evoked a prolonged response as opposed to brief tactile stimuli and involve different units than the tactile response. Continuous stimuli, which start with tactile stimuli and transition to noxious stimuli, showed a stronger response to noxious stimuli. It was also found that noxious information is carried along the nerve cord and induces escape behavior. A brief tactile stimulus caused large amplitude spikes in projection neurons at the beginning and end of the stimulus. Brief noxious stimulus caused tactile and noxious spikes as well as amplitude spikes. Tactile stimuli also evoked responses from slow motor neuron DS, but rarely in the fast motor neuron DF. That's hard to say. However, tactile noxious stimuli evoked a strong response in both DF and DS. A continuous stimuli showed a much stronger response when the stimulus transitioned to be noxious, both in the nerve cord and the leg EMG. Next, the researchers sought to calculate the conduction velocity of nociceptive axons using electrodes. They found that, compared to wind-sensitive giant interneurons, the conduction velocity of nociceptive axons was 2 to 3 times slower. Next, researchers sought to find out if head ganglia were involved in the nociceptive pathway. The head ganglia had a similar response to tactile and noxious stimuli as the other ganglia, showing that noxious information is carried up the nerve cord to the head ganglia. So what does this all mean? Well, the experiment proves that cockroaches respond to and process tactile and noxious stimuli, and that stimuli information from anywhere in the body is transported via sensory axons to the head ganglia and central nervous system. This study proves that cockroaches experience nociception and have a nociceptive pathway that is significantly different from other sensory pathways. So what does this mean? Well, entering the realm of speculation, it provides very good evidence that cockroaches might experience pain, and even if they don't, they might still be experiencing some amount of panic or suffering as a result of noxious or tactile stimuli. You might be wondering, why is this relevant for exotic pet owners? My answer to that is that if cockroaches might experience pain, other insects might too, and that opens an ethical discussion about feeding insects to animals. Firstly, is it ethical to own an exotic pet that eats insects if they feel pain? And then let me answer that with another question. Is it ethical to own a snake that eats mice? What about if they're already dead? Personally, I would argue that carnivores and insectivores need to eat to live, and if their living feed is put down in an ethical, painless way, there's no need to worry. I would have major qualms about giving a snake a live mouse knowing I can give it a frozen mouse just the same. For me, this is the same reason I'm not a vegetarian. My strict diet doesn't allow for it, but I need to eat meat, and I do my best to ensure I'm buying it from sources that butcher painlessly. That doesn't fully apply to all pet owners, and if you're in the same boat as me, you know why. This is my leopard gecko, Crouton. He is the light and joy of my life, but even a doting parent can admit when their child is just a little bit stupid. He eats a mix of live crickets and live mealworms, and he struggles even at that. Because of the way his body is and because of how leopard geckos have adapted to eat live insects in the wild, he can't eat already freeze-dried, already dead insects because he'll choke if they're too dry. If his food doesn't move, squirm, wiggle, or hop, he doesn't know that it's food and won't eat it. If it moves too much, he gets frustrated and refuses to eat. He won't even eat his sleepworms because of God knows why. I did not choose to have Crouton as a pet, but he is my responsibility now, and I have a duty to feed him, cater to his needs, and ensure he lives a happy and healthy life. For me, unfortunately, that means feeding him live insects grasped between my tongs half an inch from his face, or else he won't eat, even though I know there is reason to believe that insects feel pain. In situations like mine, where you have a frog that needs live flies or a crested gecko that needs live dubia roaches, what do? One option is to ethically source your insects. For example, PetSmart notoriously mistreats crickets, puts them in crowded conditions, doesn't sort by sex, and generally treats them like pests. If insects don't experience pain or don't experience sentience, that might be fine. But what if you, like me, believe they do understand the harm being done to them? You can order insects online, though it might be more costly, but there are places that treat insects with more respect than large chains like PetSmart and Petco. You can also breed them yourself if you have the time and space and can dedicate enough attention to separate them by sex to make sure you don't overbreed and crowd them. I don't have all the answers, but these are some questions and some solutions that came up in my own life while researching this topic, and I appreciate you listening to me share them. The ethics of pet ownership is always complicated, especially with feedings, and it's definitely something to think about when considering the nociceptive pathway of the cockroach. Thank you so much for your time, and have a lovely day.